things first, welcome to, I don't know what day it's 16th, it's the 16th of the 2nd, 2022. Hi, hello. So we're going to be talking through the Human Rights Act consultation. So I did a human rights video last year because we're going through all the different human rights that we all have and how it kind of came into how our Human Rights Act in the UK is really, really important because I've got hay fever. Really important because it actually sets out the European Convention into our domestic laws and should be used first, and all of these really great points why I get really angry that everybody always talks about European Court of Human Rights when actually it's set up on purpose so that we deal with our own. And I also linked into the International Convention and all of those other stuff. But so I need to apologise in advance because I genuinely thought I'd have had my thing kind of written up that I can kind of share with you. So it's not finalised, but actually I've done all of the kind of background and understanding that I think we need to really craft something that's important. So what I want to share with you first is my real concerns with the proposed changes and real concerns that people really aren't talking about. And then so I'm very grateful to Pixel, who kind of sent a link to an organisation that's done a really easy read document. They've got lots of kind of really helpful bits of information to help you kind of understand what it is. And then I have also, and I was going to say, I kind of think it's worth listening to the Human Rights Joint Committee videos, but they're just, there's lots of lawyers on there, and it is really kind of frustrating trying to figure out what they're saying, right? Trying to figure out what they're saying. So before doing anything and listening to things and reading things, I first sat down and kind of thought, okay, so what is my real problems based on the before listening to other people. I sat down and kind of thought, what's the real problem? Sorry, Matt, digging in my eye. Hey, Penelope, what's the real problem that I think we're facing? And it happens to be the thing that people aren't talking about. So we have to go back to the beginning, and we tend not to do this, right? So if we go way back, like hundreds of years in England, as we were, this is long before we were the United Kingdom, the people held the power. Yes, well, we had a king, but we had a good king that kind of brought everything together and created England as a whole, right? We had a really good king that created England as a whole. I mean, that's where common law came from. So common law, we say again, is simply the law that's common to all England. So there's thou shalt not murder, because that's kind of where we started, right? With God's Christian laws, if you like. And that's simply because of the time frame, you know. So we're not going back to Celts. We're kind of going 1,000 years ago. So thou shalt not murder, and then somebody would murder somebody, and what would happen is members of the village or members of the town would have to come and speak on that person's behalf. They would speak on behalf of the victim, excuse me, and it would be the people to decide what the outcome would be. And because different villages and different towns all had, like, you know, different, because they were all little kingdoms, independent kingdoms, they all had their own little different ideas of, you know, well, you murdered a child, so we're just going to fine you, or you murdered your wife, so we're going to throw you in a river, and if you survive, then you're fine. So back when England became a whole country, they created common law, which is common throughout all of England, and they literally kind of made it really simple and easy for all the different little parts of England to actually follow the same rules. It makes it easy for us if we were, you know, traveling across England. I would be fined the same, I would be treated the same. It was no longer separate countries, separate independent kingdoms. So fast forward to a few hundred years, and we with the British Empire started kind of putting our democratic principles and common law rights across other places. So we've got Canada, Australia, all of those other places that are under Commonwealth also tie into common law. So case law, which is common law, don't murder. We go to trial, we go to court, and then it's decided in court what, people argue, diminished responsibility, is it now manslaughter? All of those things have been decided not by the initial creation of the law, but actually tried in courts. And so because common law is spread throughout the Commonwealth, we actually use rulings from Canada, from Australia, and they use rulings from us. We also use them from the USA as well. So everybody who's kind of got the same sort of foundations actually keep an eye on what everybody else is doing, and so our laws and our interpretation of the laws can be fed into other countries, which is a really beautiful thing, because it doesn't have to be, right? Each individual country is sovereign still, but there's lots of interchangeability. So then we fast forward even more, and we have the beginning. End of the 1800s, right, when they're really starting to bring this kind of globalist society together, and we all have to kind of follow the One Ring, kind of like Lord of the Rings styling with the Pope at the head, right? Whatever they were trying to do, and they started the whole Hague principle and the Hague Convention, and all of that kind of happened, and everybody except England and France, right? Except England and France were kind of really happy with there being an international set of rules that everybody complied with no matter what. And we kind of put our foot down and went, sovereignty, right? We're an independent country, we have sovereignty, and so does everybody else. And nothing's changed since then with regards to international law, right? So they haven't actually managed to alter, because that's stayed true, right? So this is why the whole UN shit, if the UN had any power, they would have dealt with China. So just remember that. They actually don't have any power other than the powers that we give them. It's why we can veto things, why we can say, not going to do that. No. We also had very similar kind of opportunity when we were in Europe, if you look at the holding of the terrorists, the European court said you can't do that, and Parliament went, pretty much, fuck you, we're going to, right? So we've never really, and this was always my kind of argument about Brexit, we're taking our laws back. We never really actually lost them. There were laws that we took on because Parliament decided to, but actually they had no real say whether we did things or not. None of the other countries, that's the illusion of the European Union. They actually didn't really have any say. And love her, loathe her, whatever you feel about her, Maggie Thatcher, she did a lot of things that pissed them off by saying, no, we're not going to do those things. Okay. So then we're going to speed up to World War II, right? So we do have sovereignty, but we decided, if somebody invades, then we'll all kind of band together. Hence World War I, kind of World War II. So they did try to kind of really throw the New World Order in that bit, right? World War II happens, and then we have the Nuremberg Trials. And the UK was really, really pivotal in actually trying. There were some US lawyers, but when you look at the I was going to get my big book. When you look at how the human rights stuff has kind of progressed, the UK and the English lawyers were kind of at the forefront. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was something that was heavily influenced by English lawyers. So then when we had the European courts, the European Convention on Human Rights, again, that was very, very heavily influenced by England. And then we went and took the European Court of Human Rights, like the European Human Rights Declaration, and we kind of took it and then shoved it into our own laws. So the reason why the Human Rights Act was actually created and enacted was basically because the UK government, people kept taking things to Strasbourg, and the UK government kept getting overruled. So they didn't want that, right? So they wanted to embed it into our laws, so you have to go to our courts, and it would be decided on our own soil. And that was a really good decision. I mean, the reason Parliament did it is because they wanted to be able to keep the independence, and they wanted to still be in charge, right? Everybody's vying for being in charge. But actually, when it was embedded into our laws, it's quite important because we do have our own unique common law principles. And so the Human Rights Act is interpreted based on things that are very well established. So I think people tend to forget that we are a really, really old country with really, really old traditions. And lots of other countries are really, really old, but we kind of shoved all of our traditions on other people. Now, rightly or wrongly, I mean, it happened like hundreds of years ago. We just need to get over it, right? You can't be dealing with that shit. But so lots of other people have benefited by the things that we're doing. So the problem the major problem I see with what they're proposing in this new modern Bill of Rights is that they are going to be in it knowingly and willingly actually stripping the rights of the people, and giving more rights to Parliament and the executive branch. So Parliament is already sovereign. It does make laws. That all happened after we, Charles II, did we exile? Whichever monarch, Charles the monarch, who we kind of went, no, you are being done for treason, and, crimes against the people. That's it. You're not being the monarch anymore. At that point in time, so prior to then, Parliament and the executive branch literally just kind of did the monarch's bidding. At that point in time, we've got the monarch is now set up to protect the people, and Parliament is set up to govern, right? So they kind of separated out the responsibilities. And then we have the courts, which is our opportunity to hold Parliament to account, hold the monarchy to account, and for us to interpret the laws. So Parliament will say, thou shalt not murder, and then we go, we murder somebody in self-defense, we can argue the case, and we can make sure that the laws as they're enacted kind of fit. That's kind of how it works and has always worked. And what's happening is the proposal is being sold to us as though it is pretty much the same, because we're keeping all of the 16 human rights, right? They're not changing, so they're staying the same. And it's been sold as we are going to further solidify what the executive branch does and what the judiciary does, which sounds really good. But what they're actually proposing is saying we're going to separate it out, but we're going to also lay down really strict rules about how you can interpret this in a court of law. So they're going to be reducing the power of the courts, or that's the proposal, is reduce the power of the courts with regards to their interpretation of the Human Rights Act, which then erodes our rights. Okay, so what we're actually doing is we're going from a democracy where people make the rules. We kind of like we consent to being governed. So there's an erosion of consent. We also, David Cameron had already eroded consent a little bit, well, he did, by setting a 5-year term limit, right, on general elections. And I know they kind of like fucked with it a little bit, but actually now we have to wait 5 years. So basically now where we stand, if we have a new government and within the first month they completely destroy everything, we have to wait 5 years for them to do anything about it. there are powers that technically hold the government to account. So we do have the vote of no confidence, right? But it takes members of parliament to kind of enact that. And they're doing it now with Bojo, but just like they're just pretending and it's pissing contest, right? The actual power we have as the people is for a recall, but we can only do that if somebody has been shown to be criminal, right? And it shouldn't be that way. Like, we voted somebody in based on the promises they kind of said they were going to do. It should be a contract, right? But that's so we're already not able to kind of stop the executive branch from doing the stuff that they set the laws, we interpret them, we kind of act on them, and then the police are also interpreting them. Sometimes they arrest us, and then we go to court, and then we embed the people's understanding and interpretation, as well as the decisions by the judiciary, that then kind of feeds back into the law. So it actually works as a cycle. It's not perfect. It really isn't perfect. But government is proposing to kind of strip that back completely, and we will be descending into a communist state more than we already are, right? So they were my major concerns, and it was really kind of saddening to note that nobody else has kind of really picked up on that. Well, they picked up on the fact that the government, it looks like the government is attempting to tell the courts what to say and what to do. But the fact that nobody's really talking about, we are a democracy, this is how we runs, and in this one Bill of Rights that they're proposing is they will literally be undermining the principles of our society. It's bigger than just saying, they're telling the court. I want you to really consider it is huge. Also with the fact that the Human Rights Act is actually embedded into all of our other laws. So as it stands at the moment, every time the government creates a new law, they have to kind of look at the law, look at the legislation, and look at how and whether it is compatible with the Human Rights Act. So since 1998, they've had to create laws and legislation which are compatible with the way that the Human Rights Act is compiled. And if it isn't, so they do have a get out of jail free card, right? So if it isn't, they then invoke Section 4, and they can say, well, it's incompatible. Tough shit, we're doing it anyway. So they can already do that, right? They can already do that. So, this is why we have like the spying charter, snoopers charter, and all of those other shit kind of went through, because that is a violation of our rights. And they're just like, well, emergencies. So this is why the emergencies are important. Hence, we've got COVID, we've just seen 9/11. So I think a USA and most other countries, because we kind of farmed it off, have to be the same. So the emergency is important. Without the emergency, as it stands, the government can't do the things that they wanted to do. And the Bill of Rights will remove the need for an emergency to be in place. So we have the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, which literally means that if there is a real emergency, then the government gets more powers. Which is why they just, were drinking in a pub on a Sunday, and then Monday morning it was in law. But they were kind of getting told off for that, right? So I just want to, as a side, I'm going to read through some stuff for you guys. But as a side, the latest kind of Joint Committee on Human Rights talk. So this is the fourth one they've done. They've invited lots of individuals to come and talk to them. This is the fourth one. And the reason why this is the fourth and the consultation only started in December is they actually proposed these changes a while ago. An independent inquiry went, you don't need to change anything. You don't need to do a new one. You just need to make some tweaks to make it kind of easier for people to figure it out. The government then just went, nah, fuck it, we're ignoring you, which is what we've elected them to do. Okay, so don't kind of forget that it is what we elected them to do. So there's a guy called where's page 1 of my notes? Oh, I've got his surname written down. So Tompkins, he's Professor. Where are you? Oh, darn it. I don't have his first name. I don't know. Somebody, Professor Tompkins, who is up at University of Glasgow. I really liked him, and I really liked what he had to say. And one of the things he said was that people are making there's a lot of fuss about this, more than there needs to be. Okay, so it's very simple to kind of fix the problems, i.e., we just say, Parliament has no right to intervene in what the courts are doing, the same as the courts kind of don't really have a right to dictate rules and legislation. They will, interpret the law. So Parliament makes the law, the courts interpret the law. The problem is Parliament is telling the courts how to interpret the law. So that's the problem. So that is the only real issue. And then it kind of, it's democracy's been eroded and all of those other things. But when I looked at the consultation in December, I didn't really do much with it because I skimmed through the two, God knows how many hundreds of pages. And it was talking about it's about the separation of powers. I hadn't realized that they were literally stripping things. So I'm very concerned, right? Very concerned by the massive push about this, particularly by individuals we all know, which all happened on the exact same day, about 7 weeks after it was kind of announced, right? So middle of January, everybody was talking about this, and people are still all talking about this. And what people really weren't talking about was the fact that until midnight tonight, we have the opportunity to completely remove the vaccine mandate. There was a very coordinated amount of people talking about it at the exact same time. So I want to say thank you very much to Vicky over in TTG Roll Call, because she has been doing loads of work on it and kind of cheering everybody up for weeks and weeks and weeks. So before Christmas, she was really kind of on the ball. So that always kind of got me like, it's very interesting that seems to be on everybody's mind. And then when I've been looking at the things that they're putting out, they're not really helping people understand what's happening. So while the Human Rights Joint Committee on Human Rights thing was quite confusing to listen to, because they're talking in lots of law speak, right? Their main concerns are the separation of powers and eroding that, which eventually, basically erodes our ability to do things. And so that's not really, I don't know, from the stuff that everybody else is talking about, I'm not really seeing that as the main issue. Which is concerning. But if the main guys are concerned by it, and I already was, because the reason we have to go back to, if you think about COVID, right? So every time we reversed one of the shit that they were doing, it was because of the government's interpretation and erosion of the way that the Human Rights Act is being interpreted, right? So that's basically what we've seen for 2 years. So the fact that the Bill of Rights is literally writing into law all of the things that we've experienced and pushed back on would be lawful, right? At the moment they weren't, and that's why. So that plus the police and crime bill and the protesting and all of those things that they're changing are currently protected by the way that the Human Rights Act is created. But them changing the balance of power means that it just isn't. Maybe I'm too concerned. I don't know. Maybe I just think I see spies everywhere, right? I'm not trusting enough. That's the words. Okay, so the Independent Commission on Human Rights said it doesn't need changing, like not the way that they're doing it. So my other major concern is the fact that one of the reasons why the government say they're doing this is because people don't have any confidence in the Human Rights Act as it stands. And one of the main reasons people don't have confidence in the Human Rights Act as it stands is because the media only ever reports on it failing to work with deporting individuals, right? So that's all we hear. Now, it works really, really well, and it protects people a lot. And the media only ever reports all of the people who are not being deported. So we also have had a very timely terrorist invasion, right? Of which none of these individuals are being deported, even if they're committing crimes, because of the Human Rights Act. So what's this doing is the government is using, manipulating people's perceptions as to we need to change the Human Rights Act. Particularly what they talk about is changing the interpretation of Article 8, which is the one that a lot of the criminals use to stop being deported. But there is also the same article that protects us in day-to-day life, right? So one of the founding principles of UK law is that everybody, regardless of whether they are a British citizen or English, it is Britain. Think Britain. I say Britain, and I'm not sure because Scotland has slightly different laws. Wales has slightly different law. So England, I'm going to just talk about England, is that regardless of whether you are an English citizen or I'm pretty sure it's British citizen or not, you will be afforded the same rights as everybody else. And I do think that's a really important law. I do think that's really important principle, the fact that you can come here. You could be here on holiday, okay? So it doesn't have to be somebody who's been smuggled into the country. You could come here on holiday and not have, you've spent all your money or you saved up for 3 years and all the money you had was the money that you came on holiday. And therefore, if you've been a victim of a crime, you can't necessarily afford to fight it out in court and protect yourself. And so you get access to funds. So most people don't realise the no-win, no-fee lawyers, the reason they were set up was because they removed and got rid of the kind of government-appointed lawyers, right? So they allowed us the opportunity to go and find somebody who's going to fight on our behalf. That's how that happened. That's where the no-win, no-fee lawyers kind of came from in the UK. It was they kind of did that at the same time. So I agree with that, right? If you are here, you should be protected. However, if you're here and you're a criminal, the Human Rights Act, you can have your right to liberty is removed, right? So changing Article 8 actually is going to cause harm to many people who are in care homes and hospitals and schools and prisons who have a duty of being looked after, rather than it just kind of blocking deportation. So there's lots and lots of funny business going on in the way that it's being reported, in the way that the government's kind of lying about bullshit as they always do. But so one of the main reasons they say they're doing the Bill of Rights is because people don't have confidence, right? So rather than bringing human rights into our education system, where we all had that tutor time or whatever it was called in your school, where you learnt to, put a condom on a banana, or you had to kind of you have that hour in secondary school where you just do random shit, rather than kind of bring in understanding human rights. And one of the other founding principles of our entire legal system is that we can go and represent ourselves, right? And we're usually going to represent ourselves when we're having lots of problems with human rights. If we're going up into proper court, right, rather than small claims court, it's not civil. In human rights infringements is we don't know what they are. We don't know how we interpret them. So rather than create a new Bill of Rights, just educate people, which seems like a really simple thing to do, right? And actually, it seems that all of the experts are kind of on board with that. Like, that's like, at what point do we just go, oh, nobody understands the law, we're just going to create a new one? So in my letter, which I haven't kind of finished drafting, so I'm going to do both. I'm going to send them an email and I'm going to have a look at the questions. I think that's naughty on the consultation, right? Is they've said to professionals to send them an email, but everybody else needs to kind of follow the questions, which are really fucking confusing. But I will be linking that to the kind of example of what we do already in schools, right? So you may have, been in school, had your assembly, where a police officer's come and they've come with drugs they come with that cabinet with the drugs, and they talk to you about all the different pills, what they look like, the street names for them. They talk about what's the word? What the law says, like, what the punishment is. Like, I had not just the police didn't come for that. They came when there was the whole knife crime thing and they were doing the knife amnesty. So when it comes to other laws, of which, if I break a law, then I'm criminally responsible. So when it comes to other laws, there are quite robust training things in place inside schools. So it's not like it's not done. So so when you're looking to respond to some kind of consultation, I want you to make sure you're thinking outside of the box, right? Rather than just solely focusing on the fact that this is the Human Rights Act and proposed changes, think about what's going on in the rest of society, which makes what they're saying completely ludicrous. So if you want to change the entire Human Rights Act because people don't understand it, then you need to educate people the same as you do with this. You don't change the law. If you want to ensure that there's the continued separation of powers, you don't then tell the court system how to interpret the law. That's not Parliament's job. Because you don't do that in any other part of the law, right? So start thinking about it in terms of, okay, well, this is what they're saying, but are they doing this completely differently, or are they already doing this in other parts? So no, they're not. So we've got 16 human rights, and they're still going to stay in place. One of the points that Professor Young mentioned took me like hours to kind of briefly listen to the thing, more hours than it was there because I was busy making notes and checking things out. So one of the points that Professor Young made was that there's a point in the consultation which is saying that we should potentially have less stricter interpretation of the Human Rights Act as they stand and better interpret it based on common law principles, right? The problem is our common law and our constitution isn't written down. So again, if you do that, so at the moment, they're written down, we know exactly what it is, right? We know what it is, there's case law being built on it, and they kind of want to make it wishy-washy, roll it back to before we had it in place. So the other key thing is the reason the Human Rights Act was actually enacted was to stop us going to Strasbourg, which it's done. So why would you change it, right? So it was introduced for two very specific reasons, of which has achieved its goal. They're just a bunch of fucking liars. So no, they're going to keep all 16 principles the same. They're just going to alter the strength that they have. That's the key thing. They're going to alter the strength that they have. So I need to trim my fringe. That are going to alter the strength that the Human Rights Act have, and reduce the power that the people have. So I want you to really start holding on to the fact that anytime one of us fuck up and end up in court, we then have the power to change the way that the country is being run properly, rather than voting. Like, voting is there, but so, you know, with regards to voting, this was part of their manifesto. So the Conservative Party was voted in. This was part of their manifesto. They said they were going to look at the Human Rights Act. However, multiple consultations have said it just needs tweaking. What the government's doing is they're basically doing it over and over and over and over again until they get the answer they want. They've had multiple consultations and they've completely disregarded every single consultation, and they're just doing it anyway, which, reminder, they can do, right? It's completely up to them what they do, because we voted them in. So we, the people, have already said that we want it changed. And if they start doing polls about it, do you want the Human Rights Act revoked, is because they've been propagandering with regards to what's been in the media, with regards to that's why all the illegal immigrants and the terrorists stay here. Most people, because they don't understand how it's actually protecting us in a lot of ways, will just say yes, right? That's the problem. And that is what the government has said. You know, people don't want it in place because it's not protecting them, it's protecting the terrorists. Everything's a fucking psyop to get you to do what they want. Okay, so so we're going to go to this, the British Institute of Human Rights. So their videos were much better than Save Our Rights UK. So apologies for anybody who did go and watch that. I had to turn it off. Yes, she is introducing a new law that prevents Sadiq Khan. Not just Sadiq Khan. It's going to prevent mayors from sacking police commissioners. Yes. Which they should never have been able to do that in the first place, right? Because the police, if you've got a dodgy mayor and they just sack the person in charge of the police force, right? They should never have been able to do it anyway. But I do need to percolate on that, because there's got to be something else to that. Either this is kind of a white hat push, or there's something that we're not seeing. So I kind of I stopped taking things on face value with regards to, oh, bastard. Oh, no, here we go. Stop taking things on face value with the stuff that they do. Okay, let me just double check. You can see this. Yeah. Okay. So there we go. So the British Institute of Human Rights has come up with these kind of little short guides. So there's the Human Rights Act, separation of powers, sovereignty and the rule of law, the new Human Rights Act consultation, and the report of the Independent Human Rights Act review and the government's consultation on the Human Rights Act. They also have done, this is a 72-page document, which literally tells you how each question, so the government hasn't, right? So contrary to the consultation process and what they should be doing with consultations, so they should produce all of their bullshit, but then they should do a version that we, the people, can read. So the consultation process is a really important democratic process. It's our opportunity to ensure that we have our say on the laws that the government's creating. So yes, they have the Parliament creates the laws, but they govern by consent. They still have to kind of put it out to us, right? They can't just, we don't live in a dictatorship as much as they like it. So the consultation process is important, and this entire consultation doesn't follow any of the rules of the consultation process. So this Institute of Human Rights has actually gone through each question bit by bit. So if you want to go onto the consultation thing, it's going to tell you what the government's saying and what the government actually means. So they've turned it into real world English, because that was the huge problem with the massive document that they released. It was just full of really confusing. I mean, I think the person who wrote it should be sacked, because the idea is it's supposed to bring clarity, right? How can you bring clarity to something which you've just made confusing? Like, just stupid. They also have their unofficial guide. So this is quite good. And I've come to the bottom to get these 3 things off it. They've used very big words, but this is their thing out of all of the bits I've looked at. And again, thanks Pixel, theirs is the kind of the best. So you've got until the 8th of March to do this, right? So don't rush your thing, but do make sure that you do it. So we're going to go through these 3 things, and I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the stuff that the experts will have been saying on these 3 things as well. So firstly, the Human Rights Act, separation of powers, parliamentary sovereignty, and the rule of law. So in December 2021, a department of the UK government called the Ministry of Justice released a consultation on proposals to reform the Human Rights Act. As part of this consultation, they're asking people to respond and share their views. The UK government have suggested that the Human Rights Act needs to be changed to strengthen the separation of powers. But what does this mean? So in the consultation, the government also talk about parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. These are important ideas too, but can be quite confusing. So this short guide explains what the concept listed below mean and how they relate to our Human Rights Act. So the short guide aims to support people to understand UK government's reform proposals and to respond to the consultation, which is open until the 8th of March. It's BIHR. We think it's vital as many people as possible tell the government what they think about the HRA. The Act is all about our rights as people to hold the government and public officials to account, so any changes could affect us all. So what's a constitution? So a constitution is the established principles and rules of how a state is run. The state is the legal name given to a territory or a country. A constitution can be written down in one single law, contained in lots of different laws and documents, or established principles, or a combination. Each state will have different constitutions, and a constitution explains the rule of how 3 parts of the state, so the branches of state, should work together. This is important to make sure that no one part of the state, such as the government, has unchecked powers. So a constitution put limits on 3 parts of the state, balancing them all to work well, and sets out the rights of citizens, which these branches need to respect. So 3 branches of the state are Parliament, which is the legislator, the courts, which are the judiciary, and the government, which is the executive. Right. And so what's happening right now, so this is where the House of Lords kind of really came to their own over the forcing people to get vaccinated. And they came out with the whole report that says governing by diktat. It is this specific branch of our state power that are them and being really naughty. So how it should work, right? Parliament creates the law, sets out kind of guides of how it should be interpreted. Then that is based on what the government is kind of been putting together. So the government will look at things and be like, oh, so we'd like kind of doing with Brexit, right? Brexit is a really good example. So the different parts of the government, so you've got your Foreign Office, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Defence, all of those individual government branches will look at how the separation of the European Union is going to affect them and how they work. They create their documentation and their reports. It then goes to Parliament, and they kind of then create, based on all of this, they have, obviously there's lots and lots of discussions, and they come up with the best case scenario that's going to kind of protect the people and not cause too many problems. And then they kind of create the legislation that gets passed into law. So what's been happening is the executive branch has been kind of proposing things, giving Parliament 24 hours to kind of run through stuff, Parliament voting stuff in. They're leaving things really woolly in the laws. So what's been happening with COVID, they leave things really woolly. And then the executive branch is saying, well, this is how it now needs to be interpreted after the fact. So they're actually bypassing what we say. So Parliament votes. And remember, we vote them in, Parliament votes. So the government kind of governs, and Parliament says, yes, we're going to kind of go forward with this or not, based on the fact that the people voted us in. So it stops, you having a conservative government and I was saying a communist state, right? But that's what we've got right now. This is what's happening. So we have people who don't necessarily have conservative principles creating things, throwing it through Parliament. So they are being really naughty in what they're doing. So it's like saying, how do I explain this in a way that's kind of really helpful? Because this is the part that's falling down, purposely falling down. The balances and the checks have gone from the executive branch, and this isn't really going to be addressed, right? This is not what the government's focusing on. They're focusing on courts and Parliament. So think of all of these are all your civil servants. So in your local, let's think local, right? So you have your local council. These are all the little council departments who maybe you've got a highways department or an education department who decide, kind of what they're going to do in the local schools based on the government curriculum. The government says this, we're going to interpret it in our own little way, and we're going to kind of like put it all into the schools. But at no point is there kind of any people power, right? In that point. So with taking the schools example, if they start doing shit in schools which are causing problems, the parents can get involved. They can then go outside of the local authority and they can go to the education department, and they kind of like have a balance and a check back, right? So there's all of these things that are designed to stop what we've seen in COVID. That's what's fallen away completely. So the UK's constitution. So the UK does not have a single written constitution. This means there's no one document that contains all of the rules and principles. Instead, the UK's constitution is found through laws passed by Parliament and rules established through practices across hundreds of years and principles established in court decisions, also known as the common law. Give me 2 seconds while I just stop my phone from kind of like beeping at me. So the Human Rights Act is one of the laws that form part of the UK's constitution. It exists to set out the rights of each person in the UK and the responsibilities of all the branches of state. It's a crucial part of the UK's constitution because it sets out the rules by which the state should treat people with dignity, respect, and without discrimination. Not having a single written constitution in the UK means that it can be harder to understand if there's not one document which sets all the rules of the state. It also means that it can be easy to change the rules, which can be both be a good or a bad thing, depending on what these changes are and your opinion of what's good and bad. So changes to the constitution have included the removal of hereditary peers from the House of Lords and hereditary peers are members of this based on their birth and used to be able to pass this on to their children upon their death. And what they do now is they just throw anybody in, right? So they just stuff the House of Lords with all of their mates. Introduction of the Human Rights Act, devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which sets up parliaments and assemblies and governments for each nation. Creation of the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the UK. So being able to change the constitution relatively easy compared to states with a single written constitution could mean that our Human Rights Act is now at risk because the current Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, wants to replace it. Yeah. So UCL... a university have a good guide on the UK's constitution, which you use to help explain it, and you can read it here. So let's open that and copy link. Let's see how big it is. Copy the link address. So the original, I mean, I've got a constitution book underneath. Oh, this is only a really small one. No, that's not ours. That's not about ours, unless it was somewhere else. Anyway, so what's the separation of powers? The separation of powers is an idea which is a fundamental to how the UK works. It's about having specific and separate powers and functions between three branches of state. This is supposed to help keep three branches independent and accountable while making sure no one part is too powerful. The three branches are the legislator makes the laws. So in the UK, the legislator is Parliament, which is mainly the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So this is the one thing people forget, right? The MPs, it's not just them. It's not just them. Parliament is both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which is how the House of Commons passed putting... so the House of Commons passed putting vaccine mandates in the NHS, and the media ran with that, right? Saying it's going to be into law. And it went to the House of Lords and they said no. And so that kind of will happen November 19th. So just hold and remember that the reason why it didn't happen is because of the consultations that we all took part in last year's, because that was... If you look at the House of Lords report, they literally talk about the words that we were using. They talk about the 63,000 people who took the time to fill in the consultations. And then they mentioned, you know, the 60,000 care workers who left and the potentially 120,000 NHS workers who were going to leave. Like, it just doesn't sound like a good fucking idea. You're not doing it. So Parliament isn't just the MPs. And I think people tend to forget that. So they both debate proposals for laws, look at what changes should be made, and pass or reject laws. When a law is passed, the Crown gives it royal assent to make it official. This is ceremonial, as the monarch does not refuse to make laws passed by Parliament official. She can, right? So she can, and well, I mean, she like probably won't, right? But she can. And so with regards to war, that's the one that she's refused in the past, right? So there's not very many that she has refused, but in truth, she can refuse all of them. She can refuse all of them. And so this is, again, going back to the hierarchy that I was talking about right at the beginning, is Parliament create the laws, but the Queen or the monarch is supposed to, they say yay or nay, right? And all of their interpretation is supposed to be what's on best for the people. So neither one of them can actually do it without the other, whereas we had one going crazy, right? So that's the point. And neither one of those can do it without the other. And the House of Commons can't pass laws if the House of Lords reject it. So we saw a lot of that during Brexit, doing and throwing, as it would go up and down, up and down, up and down. So it's supposed to protect us. And when it works, it does. So it has been working during COVID, right? It has been working in England. And so then when you think about the devolution of powers, so we've got Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So UK laws are passed, and it's an opportunity of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland that their legislature they can alter and tweak things, right, based on their founding and fundamental principles, which is why they were able to do things. And they so you look at the way that Scotland and Wales have behaved compared to what they were able to get away with in England. So that's the devolution of powers has enabled that to happen. So Parliament also carries out scrutiny work, which examines and challenges the work of the government. This might be through debates, questions, or committees. So the scrutiny committees are really important. So the government will propose something, and they will they will go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And it is the scrutiny committee, the Human Rights Committee, which is doing a really good job at the moment for us. So we have devolution in the UK. So the legislature also includes Scottish, Welsh, and Parliament, and Northern Ireland Assembly. These parliaments and assemblies have been given lawmaking power by the Houses of Parliament. Now, technically, they can't. It's really weird and interesting. So they can't overwrite UK law. But where things are based on common law principles, so English common law, common to that England, is very different to Scottish common law, right? That's not uniform. So in particular, which I wasn't aware of, is a UK-wide law at the moment is the right to trial by jury. And last year, Scotland tried to completely remove that right under the guise of, the emergency. Now, they did do it partially in the United Kingdom, and they did it for a little bit, and then it got role reversed. People are like, you can't do that, right? You can't remove somebody's right to by jury, because that's set up in one of way back constitutional principles. Is no. But actually in Scotland it's not one of their common law grounding constitutional principles. And actually what they're trying to do at the moment, let me just get this right, because I was very horrified by this. So last year they tried to remove all of it, all trial by jury completely. Now they're trying to just remove it for trials of rape and sexual offences. So if there's no trial by jury, it means the judge will decide guilt or innocence. And based on the proof is in the pudding that a lot of the members of the judiciary are part of the paedophile rings, an elite paedophile rings. I mean, that should be anybody should be questioning why the fuck they are focused on just that, right? If you're going to remove trial by jury, then that's not the type of case that you want to do it on. That's insane. So the executive is responsible for creating policy, putting proposals for laws to the legislature, and putting laws into effect. So that's the government. So the judiciary decides whether laws are being followed or if they have been made properly. This is done through a system of courts of tribunal. But with regards to being made properly, once again, we have a power. The people power is a judicial review. So if the government creates a law, which is just fucking insane, we have the power to go to the courts and ask the court to do a judicial review and be like, the government's fucking insane. You need to find out whether this law that they've done is lawful and should ever have been passed. And that should have been used for the carers vaccine, but it never was, right? Not that I could find. So if it was, or there were attempts made, but they were really shoddy attempts, right? But that, in essence, should have overturned that before it got started. Should have overturned it before it got started. I thought you were saying I'm talking gibberish. Oh, no, I'm trying not to. So in the UK, the judiciary is made up of the judges or officers of the courts of law. These are overseen by the Supreme Court. The courts in the UK can decide on conflicts between state bodies, between the state and individuals, and between individuals. In the UK, we have 3 legal systems. England and Wales, then Scotland, and then Northern Ireland. And the Supreme Court is for all of the systems. And so we saw this play out last year when Scotland, so the Human Rights Act is kind of like the baseline. Scotland wanted to embed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And actually, what they were proposing to do in its entirety was struck down by the Supreme Court because they'd overstepped their boundaries. Now, not all of it was, and they were allowed to enhance things and protect people more, but actually what they were trying to do was pull away from the Human Rights Act and then just have the UN Conventions of the Rights of the Child. And they can't do that because the Human Rights Act is the law, and so they can enhance it, they can make it better, they can have better laws than us, but they can't remove and go against, right? Excuse me. And trial by jury is interestingly, is a common law right that we have in England, and it's not actually embedded into UK law, which is why they can. So the reason, just so you know, the reason why it didn't get passed is because Scottish parliamentarians pretty much went, "You're fucking crazy." No. So now they're going to pilot it, right? So they're doing a pilot of it, which means some people are going to be on trial for rape and sexual offences without a jury. So, I mean, the timing is kind of interesting, because while Sturgeon was trying to get that all through is when all the stuff was coming out about how she lied about Alex Salmond and all of those other things. So I just want you to kind of really, it's so sad, like, and the people in Scotland and Wales who are pushing to be completely separate countries again, they're so brainwashed. I mean, you just think, just look over the border at how much better our lives are than yours. Oh, man. Okay, so why is the idea of separation of powers important? So it's important that these branches of government are separate so that one branch of government doesn't hold all or too much power. Each branch is therefore able to check on the other 2 branches to ensure they're not overstepping their role. This means there's a system of checks and balances. This should prevent each branch from abusing their power and helps to ensure fairness in our system, making sure every part of the state has to play by the rules. So in the UK, we don't have a strict separation of powers. The branches of the state are closely linked. For example, Prime Minister is both the head of the executive government and generally the leader of the majority party in the legislature in Parliament. This is because to form the government in the UK, a political party has to win more local elections than other parties to have the most MPs. This means the leader of that party will be the head of the government, the Prime Minister, and will usually have the most MPs who can vote to pass laws in Parliament. So this is all relatively new, actually, the way that this is kind of set up. This is only like the mid-1700s when we had a Prime Minister, and this kind of really started forming. So this is all kind of relatively, in the grand scheme of how old the country is, it's still quite relatively new. So there are still checks and balances in place to ensure that no branch of government has too much power. For example, the legislator can keep track on whether the executive is doing their job through things such as ministers' questions, debates, and investigations by committees. And Prime Minister's questions is another example of this. So we have watched pathetic debates based on our petitions, and our petitions are another way in which we the people hold the power, right? You know, so we say, wait a minute, like there's this law's in place and it shouldn't be, you need to have a conversation about it, you need to deal with it, and you need to kind of debate it, right? We've seen really shitty debates where everybody in the room has been the individual who's like all for the government railroading everything, and then we've seen really good ones. So the vaccine for children, back in, must have been like October, November, that was a really good debate. But then the vaccines minister kind of came in at the end and pretty much went, doesn't fucking matter what you say because we're going to do it anyway, right? So that's kind of how it plays out at the moment. Technically, that's supposed to be good for us. So the judiciary courts are independent of both the executive and legislator. In the UK, judges are not elected, unlike some other countries, so they're not accountable to voters, which potentially should change. Judges are selected by the Judicial Appointments Commission based on their merit. They are independent. People can start a legal case and ask a judge to look at whether the right laws and processes have been followed or broken. This includes bringing cases that are about the actions or decisions of the executive government, and the judicial review. So judicial review is a tool to examine whether decisions by public bodies have been made in a lawful way using the correct process. That's interesting. I didn't realise it was for all public bodies. So that will include your council, hospitals. Well, that's an interesting little snippet of information there. So for those of you who have faced difficulties during COVID, particularly in hospitals, maybe schools, and doctors, with regards to not being allowed in unless you're wearing a mask, especially after the law was revoked, having a judicial review would be very beneficial. The problem is, I believe they're very expensive to do. Which is why we're doing injunction, which is coming. I'm doing the edits at the moment, but kind of we keep having all of these other things that are coming to everything happening at once. So what is parliamentary sovereignty? So parliamentary sovereignty is the defining principle of the British Constitution. So Parliament is the supreme legal authority in the UK, so they can create or get rid of any laws. The courts cannot overrule Parliament. No parliament can pass laws that future parliaments cannot change, and this is because every parliament must be as powerful as the ones before and after it. So the Human Rights Act does not limit parliamentary sovereignty. Section 19 of the Human Rights Act requires the government to make a statement on whether any laws they are proposing to Parliament are compatible with the HRA. But this is advisory only. So this means the government can say that a proposed law is not compatible, but Parliament can still pass the law, and that's what I was saying before. So this is when people are talking about Section 4, that's what they're talking about. If you watched the Human Rights Committee, they were talking about Section 3 and Section 4. And Section 4 is the statement to say that it is compatible, or it's incompatible, sorry. And Section 3 is when they kind of look at things to alter the proposed laws to make sure that it is compatible. So they kind of like get the court's help. So this is because Parliament has ultimate authority. The Human Rights Act does not change that, as noted above. Judicial review means a personal body asks the courts to look at a law or decision or action to decide if the right laws and processes have been followed. This includes whether the law, action or decision supports or breaches the rights in the Human Rights Act. If a court decides the Human Rights Act has not been followed, or if a law passed by Parliament does not support the rights in the HRA, then the courts can issue a declaration of incompatibility under Section 4 of the HRA. This is the court saying that it believes a particular law is not compatible with the rights in the Human Rights Act. This does not automatically change the law. Instead, it's the responsibility of Parliament to decide whether to change the law or not. What's the rule of law? So the rule of law is a principle that means every person Ordering some food. Sorry guys. Where are we? Go. The rule of law is a principle that means that every person and body, whether public or private, and including the state, are subject to law. This means no one's above the law, and the rule of law requires that laws should be publicly made, widely communicated, enforced equally, consistent with human rights, and not retrospective, meaning they don't go back and change the rules for events that have already happened and then hold peoples or bodies to account for those events now according to the new rules. And that any disputes about the law should be decided independently, right? Interesting. The rule of law means that people can have certainty on what the law is, access that law, and seek accountability when the rules may not have been followed. This includes accountability when executive or government may have overstepped the mark, and courts play an important role in helping people seek justice and ensure the rule of law is applied. And then there's bits, right? So with the way that they are proposing to change the Human Rights Act, which is a law, right? Okay, so it's a law. Has it been widely communicated? So I want you to think about everything else that's been going on at around the same time. So one of the things that definitely has not been widely communicated and has been completely overshadowed by Partygate is the consultation, on the revoking vaccinations. The fact that the government could argue that the consultation on the human rights was widely publicised because it was in the manifesto. So it was in the manifesto. They've been talking about it for a very long time. But the problem is the past 2 years have been dominated by COVID. And therefore, there's a potential argument to be made that many individuals who will be affected, I'm making a note of this because I want to make sure I say this, many individuals who will be affected will be unaware that it's happening now, right, because of COVID. So I'm just going to write COVID overshadowed awareness of consultation. So there's been there's a lot of problems with this freaking consultation. Excuse me. And then, so I mean, potentially under enforced equally, right? I mean, they're not making it easy for us to understand. So the Rule of Law and our Human Rights Act. Okay, I'm just ordering pizza. Sorry, guys, one sec. Pepperoni pizza and a cheesy garlic bread. Thanks. Okay. So Matt's been away again, and he was supposed to be back 3 hours ago, and he's only just got back. And I have no car because my sister's car broke down. She's got my car, so I'm trapped in the house. So sorry guys. Anyway, so our Human Rights Act is an essential part of the rule of law in the UK. It brings rights home by taking 16 of the fundamental rights in the European Convention on Human Rights and putting them into our law here in the UK. This means that individuals can challenge the government, including local government and public authorities and services, without having to go to the court in Strasbourg, France. So that's a gentle reminder, right? So if your human rights are being eroded, this is all public authorities. So this is not just Equalities Act, right? Which is one of the main things that people have been talking about with COVID, but actually if the police stop you while you're doing your lawful duties in Aldi, you have a case to be made, in your complaint to the police, that your lawful right to liberty and freedom of choice, freedom of expression was eroded when you were unduly harassed whilst shopping. So if you have got kids in school and their human rights aren't being met, one of the things that I try and weave into when I'm working with parents with young kids, like under 18s, is if we have to go up against the school. That's one of the things that we definitely weave into any of the stuff that I'm kind of writing to them. And I will always kind of involve like a psychological spin. So say, for example, there's a young lad who's autistic, who has got germ issues, who was having like meltdowns and panic attacks because like when they were cleaning the tables, nobody was allowed to be in the room, and he wasn't then allowed to make sure his table was clean with his own staff, which he knows and is safe, because it wasn't the thing that the school were using, that the school had decided was the only thing that they were going to use to cause COVID. So his human rights were like his choice, right? But actually they were torturing him. So that was under one of the rights is against prohibition of torture. So that he was being tortured by that school, because he genuinely was terrified of the fact that there was germs, and then he had to sit at the desk, touch the desk, right? That's torture. That's psychological torture was being enacted on him, and all they had to do was just allow him to be in the room, or allow him to just wipe his own desk, right? This is how insane lots of the schools were. Lots of the schools were insane and still are. So the Human Rights Act puts legal duties on the state to respect, protect and fulfill our rights. This legal duty must be met at all times, especially during times of crisis. See, this is important, right? Certain parts, certain of the human rights, so out of 16, not all of them kind of are available to us all the time. So certain ones can be kind of pushed to the side if there is an emergency. Other ones they can't. So what they did is they crossed the line with some of the ones that they just eroded, saying there was an emergency. So Human Rights Act helps to ensure accountability so that no one, including the government, is above the law. And so that is Magna Carta, Magna Carta 1297 is when it was kind of actually put into law. Is nobody's above the law. So it's our Human Rights Act, which says the state must not treat us in an inhumane or degrading way, Article 3, that our private and family life must be respected, Article 8, or our liberty, Article 5, and our right to be free from discrimination, Article 14. It's important to note that whilst the rights come from the Convention, they are now applied here at home, and it's the Human Rights Act and not the Convention which creates legal duties for people in the UK to hold government and public bodies to account. And that is why I get so pissed off with all of those cases that were being put in for judicial review and were quoting the European Convention, not the Human Rights Act. Had they used the Human Rights Act, things would have been different, right? Math, I got my card here if you want that. No. The courts also have an essential role due to the Human Rights Act. They must interpret laws as being compatible with the Human Rights Act. And if it can't be done, they can make a declaration of incompatibility. However, as mentioned, this declaration doesn't change the law. Parliament's the one who decides whether to change the law to ensure that they're compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. So I just want to, before we move on, I want to just kind of go back to something that was really kind of irritating me throughout the COVID crisis, and with the common people who were kind of pushing common law, right? And with the police. So the police is oath is to uphold the law. So lots of people were saying things like, you know, it's not your job to enforce parliamentary legislation, blah, blah, blah. Parliament creates the law. It's the police's job to enforce the law. It's not the police's job to interpret the law. That's the courts. So the police's job, if Parliament tells them that somebody not wearing a mask, not walking on their hands, and not spinning around 6 times is now unlawful and therefore need a fine, then the police will police that. But what was happening was the police is they were interpreting the law not as it was laid out, and they were over interpreting laws. So where the government had said guidance or recommendations, so the government had put down guidance and recommendations, so it wasn't actually defined in law, and the police were policing guidance. So that was a problem. So people have miscommunicated that, and I did watch quite a few videos where people were ending up in tussles with the police and they were spouting shit. And you kind of think, well, I'm not surprised the police is just looking at them like they're an idiot because they're spouting shit. So pushback by the House of Lords was the fact that the government was issuing guidance and then going on to national TV and saying it's law, and then the police were then kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Arresting people. That's not the word, but the police were then enforcing. There we go. So the police were enforcing guidance because of the way that the government and the Parliament had communicated guidance and kind of like rules and regulations and things like that, which aren't law, right? So they basically said, this is the law, this is the guidance, and then the police were enforcing the guidance, not the law, which is why they were all thrown out. It wasn't because the laws don't exist. It wasn't because the police were overstepping with regards to they were policing laws. They should have been policing laws, but they weren't. They were interpreting it incorrectly. That's what was happening. So the police don't have powers to interpret right or wrong. That's not the police's job to decide whether somebody's right or wrong. It's like, this is the law, you've broken it, and you're innocent until proven guilty as well. So, you know, that is embedded in our. But then again, you know, so when it comes back to, you know, for me with not wearing a mask, there's the exemption that the exemption was you don't have to, right? And you don't have to prove that you are exempt. That was kind of the law is, you know, wear a mask in a public space, but in that, if you're exempt, you don't have to wear one. You also don't have to show anybody. So because I wasn't wearing one, I should have been presumed innocent in the eyes of law. I'm not wearing a mask, therefore I must have a reason. If I don't have a reason, then the only thing they could have done, the policeman could have done, is said, I see that you're not wearing a mask. It is law. You need to go to court, right? It's not up to him. And if I say I'm exempt, I don't prove it there and there in Aldi. Like, that's because it was a fine, right? So you can arrest me for not wearing a mask. The only thing you do is tell me to go to court and pay my fine, not pay my fine. Care homes were and are sacking on guidance. No. So it was passed in law. However, it was incompatible with the Human Rights Act. But again, it doesn't matter. But it was actually also incompatible with the health I think Health Protection and Disease Act 1984, which says you can't mandate a vaccine. So the Coronavirus Act also said they can't mandate a vaccine. So this is where that gets really naughty. So the Coronavirus Act says you can't mandate a vaccine because it was not superseding Section 45E. Section 45E of the Public Health and Disease Act says that they can't mandate either vaccines or prophylactics. So I can't be forced to take something that the government believes is potentially going to be beneficial, the same as so it can't be like, take HCQ every week just in case you may get it. So they can't do either of those things. So what they did is they did pass the care homes into law. They shouldn't have been able to make it into law because it's already predefined in another law that you can't mandate vaccines. There's also the Equalities Act, which it was incompatible with. It was also incompatible with the Employment Act. So it should never have happened. And if it did happen, it should have been blocked. It should have been blocked by, should have been blocked in the first instance. And if it did, it should have been judicially reviewed on all of those grounds, right, which are already established in law. So the argument that the government would make, and lots of the NHS did make, is that people already have vaccinations as a condition of employment. That's not true. Lots of people do, but it's not actually a condition of employment. So they can't force you, or they can recommend, but you don't have to have it. So with the again with the armed forces, they do kind of tell you to go get all of these jabs, but you don't have to. They probably wouldn't deploy you. So if you want to go somewhere where you need to have, the yellow fever vaccine, they won't deploy you there. It's your choice to have it or not have it. So they wouldn't lawfully be able to kind of have any comeback on the way that they treat you, but it doesn't mean they won't, right? You'd have to prove it in a court of law. It was causational because you chose not to have this vaccine. But yes, so the care home staff should never have been. It shouldn't have happened. Shouldn't have happened. So why is it important to understand this at this moment? So on the 14th of December 2021, the government released a consultation paper setting out the plans for how they want to replace our Human Rights Act with a UK Bill of Rights. You can read more about the government's proposals here. Take action below. March 22, the consultation will end. After this, the government will publish a report summing up the responses. They will also have to do an impact assessment, which checks how any changes will affect different groups of people. So the impact assessment is really important. And this is what has been our saving grace, right? This is the reason. So the consultation plus this, these two things are the reasons why vaccines are being revoked as a condition of employment. The first thing is obviously we all kind of piled in on the consultations, which is taken into account. The second thing was when the House of Lords said, okay, you can do this in the care homes. However, should you attempt to extrapolate this out to any other sector, they didn't care what said, they said any other sector, you must give us the impact assessment, which you said you'd already done. So when they showed up to do the kind of passing of the Care Homes Act, they were supposed to have an impact assessment, and they were also supposed to have all of the evidence to prove safety, efficacy, and necessity. And all they ever did was keep saying that, well, we're going to trial it and see for the impact assessment. We this is the impact. We can kind of think it's going to work out like this, but they never did a proper impact assessment. And they also just kept bringing sage individuals with them who were like, oh yeah, we've got the research that says these things, but they never once presented any of this information to the House of Lords. They just said, our scientists, our experts are saying this is the case, right? So when House of Lords said, okay, you can do it in the care homes, but in order for you to extrapolate this out to any other sector, you must, this isn't like a should or a guidance, this is a must, as in you cannot create another law. You must first give us an impact assessment based off the care homes, and you also must give us the evidence that you said you have in order to mean that it's necessary. And they couldn't do either. Right, so they didn't do either. They didn't have the evidence, and they didn't have an impact assessment. So this impact assessment will be important as to whether things change, right? Particularly as the Human Rights Human Rights Committee is made up of both members of Parliament and there's a House of Lords one, right? So it's not like the government can kind of sneak in. That's a very heavily involved process of they can't sneak through. They can't just pretend and lie. So the human right. So what I mean is, because the Human Rights Committee are the ones who are asking these questions with regards to the separation of powers, is the government isn't going to be able to get away, potentially. Us, this is why we're important, the government won't be able to get away with dictating how the courts interpret the law, right? The government creates Parliament creates, government proposes the law, Parliament creates the law, courts interpret the law. Police the law, right? So that's how they all kind of work together, and we the people decide whether we want to keep it or not. Okay, every step of the way we can kind of revoke it, push back, all of those other things. So we are really, really important, and that's probably why they hate us right now. So as an aside, right, one of the things that Joe Biden did in the USA pretty much straight away when he took office was he removed the ability for people to petition. I don't know whether it's that I don't really understand which is the Senate and which is the other one. I don't know. But he removed the right to petition, right? So, I mean, straight away, you guys just got like your rights to kind of do anything removed. And so, as we've seen recently with Obama's records now being available and people are able to do FOI requests, and you guys were, what was the other thing Tory had everybody doing? Or not necessarily had everybody doing. She suggested this would be a great way to kind of hold people accountable, hold the local legislator accountable, is they just instantly, they took down the webpage, put up a new webpage and revoked your rights for redress. Even though like it was something in place to safeguard you and keep your checks and balances. So which checks on how any changes will affect different groups of people. So this is where the Equalities Act usually comes in. So the Equalities Act has the protected characteristics. So you've got illness, age, sex, gender, whatever it's called under there, so ability. So some of those protected characteristics, like the 16 Human Rights Acts, are unwavering protected, and some of them are a little bit all right protected. So age is a protected characteristic, but actually there are instances where so say, for example, you can lawfully say that you don't want anybody to work for you who are over the age of 45 if you have a really demanding job and you kind of really only want young people. So gender is no longer, it is a just permanent one, which is why, you know, the Marines and all of those individuals had to take women. Religion is one, and what they did with COVID is they removed those protections as well. So they just kind of like fucked shit up, and people let them get away with it. So if the government does then want to change the Human Rights Act, it has to propose a bill in the Houses of Parliament containing the actual wording of the new law. This has to be voted on by both the House of Commons and the House of Lords before it becomes law. It will also be scrutinised by the Joint Committee on Human Rights as part of this process. So they're the people who, I mean, as it stands, they're just like, this is a pile of garbage. I don't understand why they're doing this, right? So the government is not saying that they want to change the rights contained in the Human Rights Act, but rather how these rights can be enforced. As this guide shows, how each person in the UK accesses the human rights is an important part of our constitution, and ensuring there are checks on the power of the government. Proposals to change our Human Rights Act impacts every person in the UK and the power we have to hold the government to account. It means it's important as many people respond, blah, blah, blah. So key is that the proposals are attempting to alter the balance and give Parliament more power, which is what's dangerous. Congressional powers. Thanks. Okay, so the new Human Rights Act, Consultation explained. So the Human Rights Act was in the news yesterday. So because the government published a long-awaited report by the Independent Human Rights Act Review, and alongside the report released a new consultation paper setting out the plans for how they want to replace our Human Rights Act with the UK Bill of Rights, to put together a summary of what's happened so far and what might happen next. So the history of human rights law. The Human Rights Act is a UK law that was passed by the UK Parliament in 1998 and became law in October 2000. Before that, there was and still is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is what came after Nuremberg in World War II, and the European Convention on Human Rights. These are all connected and share the same core values. So the UDHR is a set of rules agreed upon by governments all over the world after World War II. The UDHR is not legally binding, but the rules have since been made law in lots of countries. Now, just quickly jumping to the US for a little bit, because I know there's a lot of you lovelies from the USA, is that you don't have like a human rights law, and you're also, as far as I can remember, not actually signed up to any of these things either. I'm pretty sure it's just the USA and Somalia that aren't signed up to the UN Convention on Human Rights. Not that it matters, because it's not enforceable, because, you know, it's sovereignty of the state. But actually, what was I going to say? But it's just because you have your declaration. But American lawyers, human rights lawyers, helped write it. So you guys helped write it. You and us, as in USA and UK, helped kind of really formulate it. But you guys didn't sign up to it because you have your constitution. So European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, or the Convention. So an agreement made in the 1950s. It's based on the rules in the UDHR and signed by all the governments in the Council of Europe, including the UK. And if a government doesn't look after its citizens' rights, the citizen can take their case to the European Court on Human Rights, and this is separate from the European Union. Okay, so we are still signed up to the Council of Europe. So we are still and do still fall under the European Court of Human Rights. So here's the kind of potential safety net we have right now. Potential safety net. If the government just ignore everything and like crash forward, what it means is we can then go to our domestic courts. And then if we don't get what we want, is we can then go to the European courts, right? So as an aside, if you are going up against, if you want to lay a case, you have to make sure that you include both the UK Human Rights Act and the articles, as well as the European Convention. Because what happened very recently over in Northern Ireland or Ireland, either Ireland or Northern Ireland, there was a baker who said no, he wasn't going to bake the cake for the gay couple. He didn't get the result that they wanted in the domestic courts, and they then took it to Strasbourg, and Strasbourg said, we're not even going to consider. So they kind of rejected it, but they didn't reject it because of what they were proposing. They rejected it because they hadn't made claims with regards to the European Convention. So just, if you are ever going to write a case or go up against the UK government or the UK judiciary with regards to human rights, do make sure you need to kind of precede it with the European Convention, just in case, right? Because otherwise it won't be heard. So then the Human Rights Act. So the UK law, that means public bodies have to look after the human rights included in the ECHR, and UK judges have to consider it when they make their decisions. And that's important. So they have to consider it, but they don't actually have to pay attention to it, right? So in the beginning of the beginning of the Human Rights Act, we did kind of really pay attention to what was going on in the European courts, and then we have since gone further than some of the cases that they've put down, and then also where our common laws are incompatible with what the case law has provided in Strasbourg, we will ensure that our common law and our constitution it is embedded into the decisions. So we do go with it, and we do completely ignore it, right? So they have to kind of look at it, but they don't have to follow it. So the Human Rights Act was passed by Parliament with cross-party support, and it was introduced when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. He said he wanted to bring these rights in the ECHR home, and to give people in the United Kingdom opportunities to enforce their rights under the European Convention in British courts, rather than having to incur the cost and delay of taking a case to the European Rights Commissions and Court to Strasbourg. Now, it's really interesting that it's TB, right? TB, who is the person who actually introduced this. Why? Because if you look at his wife, Cherie Blair, she is a human rights lawyer, and she has fought in the courts on behalf of some of the most horrific terrorists, and blocked their deportation using the Human Rights Act. So do you see why they really brought it in? And why it's coming up now? So we've got like 24 years ago, we got the same playbook, right? So they brought it in so that they could, terror threats. So what was going on at that time with, what was coming? We were going to have 9/11 and Syria, the attack, the wars, all of those things. So what's happening now with the financial crash, all of that stuff kind of like happened after. And what we're seeing now is the illegal invasions, and people just still aren't being deported because of this law. So now they want to make it worse. So it's the same. They've been using, importing terrorists and using terrorists as the reason to kind of try and get the public to push back against removing it. But it needed to be in place in order to stop Like, you can't have terrorists in the United Kingdom if we can easily deport them. So it had to be brought in order to keep the terrorists here. And the only reason they're considering to remove it because of the terrorists is because they're now going to strip people of even more rights. So it's like circular. Yeah. Especially as we know, Tony Blair is disgusting and a war criminal. So what's happened so far? So in 2005, when Michael Howard was the leader of the Conservatives, he complained about the rights culture created in the Human Rights Act and the protection of special interest groups. During his campaign, he said that if the Act can't be improved, it will be scrapped. His campaign was criticised by lots of people in the UK for targeting ethnic minorities, especially travellers and asylum seekers. In 2006, when David Cameron was leader of the Conservatives, he said he wanted a UK Bill of Rights instead of the Human Rights Act during the Labour government. Key figures also publicly criticised the Human Rights Act, with Jack Straw, then Justice Secretary, telling the media he was greatly frustrated by the way the courts sometimes interpret the Act. Okay, so this is quite literally what they're trying to do now. They're trying to get tell the courts how to interpret it. In 2009, the Labour government launched a consultation on rights and responsibilities, developed a constitutional framework, looking at a new constitutional settlement. In 2010, Labour lost their place as the party. The coalition government, led by David Cameron, put together an independent team of people known as the Commission on a Bill of Rights to investigate the idea of creating this bill. The Commission published a consultation, and it was decided at the time the Bill of Rights wasn't needed because the UK already has a Bill of Rights in the shape of the 1998 Human Rights Act. And we actually already have a Bill of Rights as an actual individual. So I'm looking for my constitution book. This is called a Bill of Rights already. So we already have one. In the 2015, the Conservative Party set out in their manifesto that they would scrap the Human Rights Act and curtail the role of the European Court of Human Rights so that foreign criminals can be more easily deported from Britain. Conservative Party won that election with a small majority of 11 seats. 2019, the Conservative government, now majority of government led by BJ, said in a statement about leaving the EU, it would respect the framework of the ECHR. And this statement was not legally binding, but was agreed between the UK and the European Union. However, the government said they would wait until after the UK had left the European Union before considering it fully. This made a lot of people worried that they would change their minds about respecting the ECHR. The current government plans. So in December 2020, the government set up the Independent Human Rights Act Review Panel to see how the Act is working and whether it needs to change. In January 2021, the panel published a call for evidence, a set of questions about the Human Rights Act. And so you've got to remember, like, this is when they were playing up, they did the snap. We had the snap lockdown. We had Delta was murdering people while they were Christmas shopping. So feeding into, was it really widely disseminated if all the work has been done when COVID has dominated? Any person or organisation could answer. It closed in March 2021 and the responses were published on the gov.uk website. Over 400 people submitted a full and easy read response to this review. In January 2021, the Joint Committee on Human Rights also put a call for evidence in relation to the Human Rights Act review. This was so that they could use the information they gathered in their responses to the panel. They also used the information as part of their own inquiry into the Human Rights Act. And they published their findings June 2021. October 2021, the panel wrote a report of their findings and sent it to the government. And on the 14th of December 2021, this report was published on the Gov website. You can read the full report, 580 pages, and an executive summary here. On the same day, the panel's report was published. The government released a consultation paper containing their suggestions of ways to change the Human Rights Act. They want to replace it with the Bill of Rights, while the consultation refers to the independent review report. The proposals go much further than the review suggested. And then they've shared it with the people. So what happens next? The law has not changed and the proposals in the consultation paper are not final. The government's code of practice on consultation says a consultation paper should not be put out if everything is already settled, because the responses should influence the final policy. In March 2022, the consultation will end. After this, the government will publish a report summing up the responses, and they will also have to do an impact assessment which checks how any changes would affect different groups of people. So it may be pertinent to, in your responses or in our responses, include protected people of characteristics. So say, for example, masked kids with like allergies. Right, that's why, I mean, I was probably never going to wear a mask anyway, but like a genuine reason, if I ever had to go to court, you know, I could prove and give that, I mean, why would I put a mask on my face which is going to collect all the freaking pollen and shit? It's stupid. So maybe put something in with regards to protected characteristics, because that has to go into their impact assessment, right? They have to make sure that laws are going to be equal. That's what it said right at the beginning. What's the rule of law? That it's equal. If the government does then want to change the Human Rights Act, it has to propose a bill containing the actual wording of the new law. This is then voted on by the House of Commons and the House of Lords before it becomes law. It'll also be scrutinised by the Joint Committee on Human Rights as part of this process. This means it's important that as many people as possible respond, their voices are heard before decisions are made about their rights. So then this is the independent report. Right. So I'm going to skip to, here we go. So respecting our common law traditions and strengthening the role of the UK Supreme Court. So the UK Supreme Court is the highest court within the UK. It means that it's the final court of appeal for cases in the UK. According to Section 2 of the Human Rights Act, all courts in the UK must take into account any relevant cases decided by the European Court of Human Rights. This is because the European Convention on Human Rights is a living instrument. This means that although the convention was created over 70 years ago, it's still relevant as it adapts to society today. Dealing with situations that may have been completely unforeseen in 1950. For example, many developments in relation to the rights of LGBTQ plus people who would never have been possible if the convention was not able to evolve with society. The government suggests that this duty should be changed, and UK courts should instead just look at the text of the rights themselves and at decisions previously made in the UK. By doing this, the government believe they will be demonstrating that UK law takes priority. This could narrow the interpretation and application of the Human Rights Act, as the UK will still be within the European Convention system. People will still be able to take cases to the European Court of Human Rights for a decision there. This could mean more cases being taken to and decided by the European Courts of Human Rights. So we'll just do this bit first, because this was discussed quite a lot. One of the things that the experts were suggesting is the fact that all they need to do with this is change the word of must to may. But it goes a bit deeper than that. What the government is really trying to say is that the courts need to interpret the Human Rights Act as is written and only based on UK decisions. So ignoring things that are going on in the European Court of Human Rights. Now, that will make it harder for us to kind of lay a claim, right? So the government can just reject things, because they are wanting to kind of really stipulate how things are interpreted. So you could take a case and it keep getting rejected, but somebody in another country in Europe can take a case, get European Courts of Human Rights, and in theory, is we would then be able to say, actually, it was case law there, therefore it makes sense that it can actually work with our constitution. So what they want to do is they want to take away the opportunity for us to kind of use the European Convention. So what will happen potentially is that we will then go all the way through to the Supreme Court, reject, and then we have to go to Strasbourg. Because it's something that's case law in Strasbourg already, then we get accepted. So what then happens is the UK government gets egg on its face because they get overruled. So contrary to what they said they were doing, which was, making UK law supreme, their suggestions actually reverse, right? Because they then give us the opportunity to go to Strasbourg. I mean, we do get that now anyway, but more people potentially going to have to go do it. And the Human Rights Act was brought in to kind of stop that. So it's like defeating the object of the last 24 years of the Human Rights Act. Like, it just doesn't make sense. So they were really, really critical of what they were trying to do with Section 2. I might have already written that in my bit. Give me a sec. It's also unnecessary to do that. So the other reason why they want to kind of weaken Section 2, as in make us less dependent on case law from the European Court of Human Rights, is because they're saying, well, they want us to use the case law from across, Canada and Australia and other Commonwealth countries. So it's kind of irrelevant because they already do that. So on the surface, it looks like a case of, well, actually, we're already doing all of those things. This is an irrelevant thing to put in there. But me being concerned with the shit that they put in there means that I'm going to completely argue against this. It's as unnecessary. It's unnecessary to make any changes because we're already doing these things. So if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? We're already doing these things. You don't need to do it. By altering the wording, you're going to erode the success of the last 23 years of the Human Rights Act, potentially increase the number of people who then have to seek outside domestic courts, and you're actually going to have the reverse of what you want. Oh, so you're saying you want this thing, but what you're actually going to enact is going to do the opposite. So the Consultation also suggests that the Bill of Rights should contain a provision that highlights the importance of the right to freedom of expression. This right is already contained in the Human Rights Act, and it's protected by Article 10. It also has an extra protection, Section 12 of the Act, that courts have to consider this right in any orders they make. It's a non-absolute right, which means it can be restricted in certain circumstances, so like COVID. So like most rights, the right to freedom of expression must be balanced against other rights. The government wants to set out guidelines on how this right should be balanced and that it should only be limited in exceptional circumstances. Currently, any non-absolute right can be limited if the measure is lawful, legitimate, and proportionate. So lawful is a law that allows the restriction. Legitimate, the restriction falls within a reason allowed in the text of the right. And proportionate, restriction, the least restrictive option is available. So considering at the same time, so this is what I think they're doing with this, right? This is their sneaky, underhanded tactic going on here. So what they're saying with this Bill of Rights is we're going to really strengthen up the freedom of expression, i.e. you want to go protest, or you want to tell people that you believe Trump won the election, all of these things. We're going to strengthen that, right? but at the same time, they are introducing other laws which make you a domestic terrorist, that restrict the rights of protesting, that enable you to be spied on, your friends to be spied on. So the Bill of Rights is saying they're going to strengthen it, but then at the same time, they are introducing parallel laws which actually remove that right from in the places that they want it to be removed. And then they will just say, Section 4 is incompatible. We're doing it anyway. So this is smoke and mirrors. They're not actually doing this, or they might be doing it in this Bill of Rights, but they're not actually doing this. Does that kind of make sense? So restoring a sharper focus on protecting fundamental rights. So the Consultation suggests introducing a permission stage for bringing human rights cases to court. This could mean that an individual would have to demonstrate that they have suffered a significant disadvantage in order for the case to be heard at court. The individual would be responsible for showing that they've suffered this disadvantage. This would reduce the number of human rights cases heard in our courts. It's important to know that already under the Human Rights Act, legal action can only be taken if the individual is a victim of the human rights breach. So how, you would have to prove, what's significant, right? So at the moment, you just have to be a victim. So you just have to, so your rights just need to be infringed. You just need to be a victim. They want to change it. It has to be significant. So let's put this into kind of context of physical violence. Not the Human Rights Act, just like, I walk into a bar and I punch you in the face, but I'm really little and you're quite a big person. Somebody could say, well, actually, that's not really significant compared to somebody who walks into a bar and beats the shit out of somebody with an iron bar, right? So when you're doing significant is you are no longer treating people as equals, because significance will be personal, right? So somebody who has this entire consultation process, right? So I have a master's degree. I don't have a master's law degree, but I do have a master's degree, which means I've got a higher, level of intelligence of somebody who potentially academic intelligence and understanding than somebody who has just got GCSEs, right? And we're both expected to respond to this on the same level. So we're no longer equal. So it should just be, actually, I don't have to prove. So the person who's just got GCSEs would be able to prove that they were at a significant disadvantage because they've only got GCSEs, and this is quite complicated. I would probably not be able to prove I've got a significant disadvantage because I have a master's degree, and they'd be like, well, technically, and you deal with these sorts of things on a regular basis when you go up against, but it doesn't mean I deal with like legal bullshit. So it means we're no longer equal. So we're both victims, whereas we are now, whereas a person with a potential advantage is no longer, their rights, it's supposed to just be like unilateral, regardless of who you are, how old you are, what colour you are, what age you are, regardless. Like, if you are human and you are in the United Kingdom, you're human and in the United Kingdom, whether you are a citizen or not, these rights are afforded you. It's also suggested that human rights should only be used if there are no other claims that can be made. Currently, a person in a case under private law, for example, negligence, but they may also be able to use the Human Rights Act in their arguments. This is because other laws should be applied in a way which is consistent with the Human Rights Act. So this suggestion can reduce the number of human rights cases heard in our courts, which may increase the number of cases having to go to the European Courts of Human Rights. So how could this potentially negatively play out in the real world? So COVID, they made vaccines a condition of employment. It was a breach of human rights, okay, which is the bedrock of us, our protection. So this is important. The Human Rights Act at the moment is the bedrock of us being protected, because that is also against the Section 45E, is if you try to take it to a human rights court, they would say no, because it's breaching a different law. And then they would say no, because it was an emergency. So you've instantly lost your ability to actually protect yourself, and then, you know, hold the government to account if they have eroded your human rights. So again, if we go back to the previous one with freedom of expression, like, it's completely irrelevant because of the other laws that they are creating. So you wouldn't be able to go and say, well, this law's breached my human rights, because they'd be like, yeah, we don't give a shit. And no, you can't make a case based on human rights because this law deals with that. It's really fucking annoying. Preventing the incremental expansion of rights without democratic oversight. So under Section 3 of the Human Rights Act, any laws in the UK must be read in a way which is compatible with the ECHR. This can only be done by courts when deciding cases. It's also an important tool for public officials to consider when making decisions, so they can be rights respecting in the first place and avoid being taken to court. The consultation proposes that Section 3 should be replaced with a provision which sets out how legislation should be interpreted. This could mean the power to interpret legislation could be restricted. Currently, if a non-absolute right must be restricted, that restriction must be proportionate or least restrictive. The government suggests this means that lawmakers cannot balance individual rights with the wider public interest. Instead, they want to place further weight on the view of Parliament, and this may reduce the importance of proportionality. So this is an important little thingy, right? Important tool for public officials to consider when making decisions. So every single school, every single doctor's surgery, every single hospital, every single public, the council, all of those things, right? So the government said, this is the COVID law, this is the guidance. Every single one of those individual institutions was supposed to take that information and check whether it is compatible with the Human Rights Act and the Convention on Human Rights. And none of them did, right? So this is your pushback at a local level for anything that they've done. If you're still kind of in a fight with them, like, where is their impact assessment of this based on their lawful duty as a public body to ensure that it is because the government will say, well, we did because, you know, it was just guidance. You didn't have to do it, you know. Same with Partygate, well, it was guidance. It wasn't law, it was just guidance. So they enforced it. We didn't enforce it. We told you what we recommended and you guys went and just went crazy. The consultation also suggests that the use of human rights law by foreign criminals who are going to be deported should be restricted. The government proposes that rights such as the right to liberty and the right to a fair trial and the right to respect for private and family life should not be able to use to prevent deportations. The government have used an example from a decision in 2009 to justify this. However, there was a significant change in the law in 2014, which means the situation should no longer occur. The government also indicate that these restrictions should apply in all cases of illegal migration. I really, and I know this is probably going to sound quite, some of you guys probably aren't going to agree with me on this. I 100% stand behind anybody who is in our country should be afforded the same rights as citizens, because restricting the rights of the vast majority of fighting age males who are landing at Dover are being brought in for a specific narrative, right? But that doesn't mean there isn't potentially people in this country who have, and this happens quite a bit as well. So I want to think more, so Eastern European. There's lots of people who have been smuggled into this country So we do have the Slavery Act, right? But people who are smuggled into this country under promise of, being a model, and then they are trafficked into, human traffic, right? They're trafficked into being sex slaves and all of those things. You've got to be really careful about deciding specific groups of people need to have different rights while being on our shores because of the laws of unintended consequences. And the fact that the government is purposely talking about this one group of individuals who are it's purposeful, right? It's purposeful. So there's an agenda behind it, and we have to step outside of the agenda and be like, okay, but what really happens? What really happens? So the other thing, though, is if somebody is convicted of a criminal offence, is they actually remove their right to liberty anyway. Right, that's part of it. Is Human Rights Act says you can't remove anybody's right to liberty unless they've been convicted of a criminal offence. So if they've been convicted of a criminal offence, they do have a right to a fair trial. They have a right to a fair trial because how do we know it really is them, right? We know the government. I mean, they're dodgy as fucking stitch people up all the time. We know the police, these dodgy police officers. So I want you to consider that. Well, what if you just so happened to maybe you'd lost your passport, I don't know, whatever, but they could. Not everybody is bad people, and we have a duty to protect the people who are innocent, who potentially could get royally fucked over. And we can change things in different ways, right? There's a different way to protect the majority of people in the UK from the criminals. So they've put in here that they changed the law already. Yeah. So it's important to note, currently the Human Rights Act does not prevent, and it doesn't prevent deportations anyway, right? These do still happen. Changing any of the rights due to concern in one area will likely impact those rights in other areas. For example, the right to respect family private life has been very relevant during the pandemic to help people keep contact with loved ones in care homes. So that one, it's dangerous. So emphasising the role and responsibilities within the human rights framework. So human rights are universal. This means they apply to everyone, regardless of their personal situation. This applies to the rights in the Human Rights Act. The consultation suggests introducing the idea of responsibilities into the human rights framework. These responsibilities are on the individual. This suggestion could mean that an individual's behaviour could be considered when deciding whether it is acceptable to limit somebody's rights. The consultation also suggests that an individual's behaviour should also be relevant when deciding on any remedies that they may be entitled to for the breach of the human rights. So behaviour from the past may also be used to reduce or remove any awards of compensation. This may mean that not everybody is entitled to the same rights. So social credit scoring. So this is social credit scoring coming into the Human Rights Act. So you haven't been vaccinated, therefore you don't get the same rights as everybody else. You attended a protest, therefore you don't get the same rights as everybody else. It's important to note that human rights are about rights of individual people and responsibilities of government and public bodies to respect and protect those rights. Our Human Rights Act includes consideration of some behaviour where relevant. For example, people convicted of a crime may have their liberty restricted with a prison sentence. That's it, right? I mean, they're not allowed to vote, but that's the only time that somebody's liberties are restricted is when they have been convicted of a crime, and which, because they've gone against the moral fabric of society, right? Like, huge moral fabric is they've caused, and that comes back to our common law underpinning, which is harm against a person or their property. And because they have gone against our core common law principles of how we exist in society, so they've harmed a person or a person's property, they then are no longer allowed to benefit from the the rights afforded to those who are free and peaceful citizens. And that comes way back to when we started like 1,000 years ago. So to the King's Peace. So initially, the king set the laws, and if you broke the King's Peace, means you broke the law, you broke the common law. So this is where we have to make sure that we're really understanding the real intricacies of where everything's kind of wound up. So it's because it is a human rights act, but it is grounded in our common law principles. And excuse me, even though the Constitution's not written down, they're grounded in the common law principles. But it's so obvious what we're attempting to do here. So facilitating consideration of and dialogue with Strasbourg while guaranteeing Parliament its proper role. The consultation suggests that Parliament should have a stronger role in responding to the European Court on the Human Rights. They want this to ensure that Parliament has the final word if there's a ruling by the European Court of Human Rights finding that the UK breached an applicant's human rights. So they're basically saying, okay, fine, we accept that this is probably going to mean more of you get pissed off, go to the Human Rights, European Court of Human Rights, but actually doesn't fucking matter because we are still going to have the final say. So if it goes to Strasbourg and they rule in your favour and against all of the English courts, UK courts, when you come back, it's tough shit. Which is crazy, right? Which you then say, okay, but then so why still be signed up to the European Convention? Because we could just leave. So if we should just leave it, if they are that bothered, right? If they are that bothered about us going to the European courts for human rights, then we should just leave it, and we should be fully independent, which is what many people thought they were getting with Brexit, right? So currently Parliament is responsible for responding to negative judgments from the European Court of Human Rights, as was demonstrated with the discussion around prisoner voting. So Parliament can decide whether they do or don't change the law in response to a judgment. Over a decade after the issue was brought to the European Court of Human Rights, a small change was made to the rules around prisoner voting, which meant a small number of prisoners would be able to vote. This brought the UK in line with decisions by the European Court of Human Rights without a large change in the UK's law. So with many people wanted, right? So let me just share this. So everybody wanted to leave Brexit, right? To leave Europe. And a lot of the reasons they wanted to leave Europe was because the European Court on Human Rights was overriding what the government was saying. And that's what, the government kept saying, right? And that's one of the things that they just never bother changing. We never came out of. It still counts. So it is possible as it stands today. So we just have to remember that they can just do whatever the fuck they want, right? That's technically we can all fill in this information. We can all do these consultations, and they can just change. They can decide to do it anyway, right? Now, usually, that's not kind of what members in the House of Commons do. They tend not to just do it anyway because they like the power. They like the power. They want the power, and they can be removed. So usually it has a bit of a sway or a bit of a, where are we, 2019, 2020, 21, 22. So 2024, So they'd only have 2 years, right? And so we're in consultation phase. They then have they'd have to create the law. They would have to go, through the Houses of Commons, through the House of Lords, and Queenie's assent. So it would take at least a year to 18 months in order for it to kind of be passed and go through and embedded right around the time we're having an election. And if people are really angry, they won't get re-elected. So who knows? But yeah, so key things. So I will be kind of like finishing my letters. We've got until the 8th of March to get it done. But those are things that I would kind of consider. This is a lot of smoke and mirrors, a lot of bullshit. A lot of smoke and mirrors. It's going to erode. It's going to erode our rights. It's going to erode the courts' rights, and we will truly enter government by diktat. We will truly enter a communist society. So potentially this is being done. So let's just think about what's going on in the political landscape, right? So potentially this is being done on purpose because they are pushing for a Labour flip, right, at the next general election. So this would be perfect. This going through would be perfect for the WEF, commies taking complete control. Right, so this is where we're heading. Trump's in control. I think that there's lots of white hats who are. I think there's the cabal still have their feet in lots of pies, and lots of people. So a bit of both. I think Boris got COVID and they swapped him out, and they keep. Sajid Javid is WEF. They're all freaking Klaus Schwab's butt buddies. So bit of both. I will formulate my official response, and I will kind of put together some key bullet points as well. But I hope this has kind of been helpful. And helped you kind of understand. I mean, from a conspiracy theorist point of view, right? This is what I'm doing. I'm seeing this and looking at where they're going, and where they're going is for all-out communism, right? This is they're eroding all of the things all of the protections we've had in place over the past 2 years. They need to get them removed. We'll see. So have yourselves, thank you so much for joining me, my lovelies. Have yourselves an amazing rest of your Wednesday. Have a great evening. Bye for now.